During a road trip I was on this year, I stayed at 2 Airbnbs. Both were just overnight stops for me to sleep at, not so much to actually enjoy. I drove for 10 hours from my house to the first Airbnb, which was out in a small town in the middle of nowhere. When I arrived, I wasn't expecting it to be as small of a town as it was. In total, there were no more than 30 or 40 homes, with a single grocery store and a few other markets in the center. I pulled into the driveway of the Airbnb. It was listed as a single-bedroom home, and the pictures were pretty nice, except they never displayed the outside of the house. Now I could see why. The house was old and likely hadn't had any exterior work since it was built. All that mattered was the inside, but seeing the outside didn't keep my hopes up. I got out of my car, grabbed my bag from the trunk, and as I walked up to the front door, I felt something strange. I stopped and listened. The town was completely silent. It was late, so it was probably normal for it to be quiet at this time, but I'd never been in a town this small before. Even at night in most places, there's some sort of noise, whether it's crickets, distant dogs, or a faint hum of a streetlight. But here, there was not a single sound at all. I shook off the uneasy feeling and continued up to the door. I opened the lockbox and retrieved the key, only to find the door was already unlocked. Slowly, I opened it and called out, asking if anyone was home. I didn't hear a response. The inside of the house seemed empty, with all the lights off, so I stepped inside, making sure to lock the door behind me. The first thing I did was walk around the house to see if everything was okay. The inside was much nicer than the outside, and I assumed the door being left unlocked was just a simple mistake, as there were no other signs of anything unusual. Relieved, I decided to go to bed just 15 minutes after arriving, needing to get up and drive again in less than 8 hours. I fell asleep quickly, but then woke up a few hours into the night, my mind alert despite being tired. I was unsure why I had even woken up. I turned and checked my phone for the time, and that's when I heard something from outside the room. A dull thump, like something hitting the wall. My body tensed. I jumped out of bed and looked at the door with wide eyes, but the sound had stopped. I slowly opened the door and checked. The hallway was empty. There was nothing on the walls to show where the thump could have come from. I stepped further down the hall, keeping the lights off, and looked around the corner into the living room. That's when I saw him. A man sitting on the couch, facing away from me, staring forward into the unlit room. My stomach dropped. I froze up, watching him sit there without moving, as if he wasn't worried about being in someone else's house. I carefully and quietly walked back to my room and locked the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I reached for my phone and called the police. I knew I was far out, and I didn't know how long it would take them to arrive. I sat in the corner of the room in silence, waiting for what felt like an eternity. An hour. During that hour, I never heard any sounds from outside the room. Not a footstep, not a thump. Just silence. When the police finally arrived and searched the house, the man was gone. The only sign of him was the front door, still unlocked. Once the officers left, I continued with my road trip. I didn't want to spend another moment in that town. The host of the Airbnb gave me a refund and stayed in contact with the police about the incident, but I stopped receiving updates after a few days. I still don't know what really happened that night or who that man was. I'm not sure I ever will. I owned an Airbnb house for several years, but I stopped due to the stress of keeping up with it as well as maintaining my actual job. The benefits of using Airbnb instead of renting the place out like you normally would is that you have the chance to make a lot more money if your house gets booked often. Being in a relatively high-traffic area for vacations, Airbnb was a great option for us. My wife and I were excited in the beginning, but it got more demanding as more people booked the house. We needed to keep everything on schedule and hire cleaning services after the first customers left and before the next ones came, as well as be sure to respond to their messages and emails in a timely manner. Things were going well for a couple of years before we had what we thought was a young couple staying at the house, just like every other time. When they arrived, I texted them the unlock code for the door. I almost never actually saw the customers after they let me know that they were inside and everything was good. I sat back and relaxed for the rest of my day off. I should also mention that I almost never talk to the customers more than just a couple of texts. Usually they text me when they get there and when they leave, and sometimes an occasional question about the house, but that's usually it. But as 9 o'clock came around and I was just about to get ready for bed, I got a text from the young man staying at the house. It was short, saying he was going to call me in a minute, and then a minute later he called. I already had a bad feeling when I saw the text, but what he said still surprised me. He said that the water wasn't working in the house. Of course, I apologized, though I didn't understand how that could be possible. But living in a house without water is unacceptable, so I knew I had to get it fixed immediately. I asked if I could come check it out quickly so that I could have someone come in the morning to fix it. He agreed, being very polite about the whole thing, and I drove over there a few minutes later. Pulling into the driveway, I noticed 2 cars. At the time, this wasn't necessarily a red flag, but more just an odd thing I noticed because they were apparently a young couple on vacation for a single night. So I didn't understand why they would rent 2 separate cars. I thought someone must be visiting them, which actually isn't allowed, but I didn't mind so much. I walked up to the front door, knocked before entering the code, and walked inside. It was very quiet. I expected them to be waiting for me, but they weren't anywhere that I could see. I probably should have looked around for them first, but I was tired and just wanted to get this over with. The first thing I wanted to check was the main water valve to make sure there wasn't a leak or flood, so I went down to the basement and over to the valve. Everything seemed normal, no water anywhere or signs of damage. I was confused, but then I fiddled with the valve and immediately heard water start rushing again. I turned it more, realizing it had been completely shut off manually. I stayed in the basement for another minute trying to understand why this was done, before I started to get a really uncomfortable feeling, especially since I didn't even see the people when I walked inside. I just couldn't see how it could have been anyone other than them who turned off the water, which meant they were trying to get me to come over on purpose, or maybe give them a discount on their stay for the inconvenience. I decided I was going to leave and get my car, then try calling them back just to be safe. I got up and started walking toward the stairs until I heard the basement door open, followed by multiple sets of footsteps walking down. When they got to the bottom, 3 men stood there. "Is it fixed?" one of them said, sounding like the same man I talked to on the phone, though all of these men were much older than the young man I thought was staying at the house. I told him it should be working now and that the valve must have just tightened on its own. I was trying not to point any blame, since the whole thing was making me so uncomfortable. I just wanted to get out of that basement and away from these guys. They all just kind of stood there, looking at me, not saying anything after that. "Well, let me know if you need anything else," I said, walking between them, trying to get to the stairs. They still just stood there, watching me walk around them. But as I went past the 3rd guy closest to the stairs, I spotted a gun shoved in the back of his pants. It made me freak out a little, and I rushed a bit quicker up the stairs, but they didn't follow. They stayed in the basement as I quickly walked out the door and drove away. When I got home, I woke up my wife and told her what had happened. She convinced me to call the police to check up on them. They weren't the people we thought were staying there, and the situation was strange, so it felt justified. I think we waited 20 minutes before a call came from an officer claiming nobody seemed to be home and that he might need me to open the door. I gave him the code instead, and he called back another 20 minutes later, saying that there were no signs of anyone still being there. The next day, we found out the card the man paid with was stolen, and after looking around the house, they had stolen some expensive decorations and appliances as well. I guess there never actually was a young couple either. The one thing that was left unexplained was their whole plan with the water not working. I think they either wanted me to not charge them for their stay so that hopefully they could use the stolen card for longer, or they were planning on robbing me at gunpoint. But then that makes me question why they didn't. 3 dangerous, unidentified men were blocking my exit in the basement after leading me into a trap, and they just let me go. It doesn't make sense to me. But after that, I never went to the house while customers were home, and a few months later, we stopped using Airbnb and just put the house up for rent. I was on a road trip from Portland to Chicago. It's nearly a 3-day drive, so I had some places booked to sleep at along the route. I didn't get too particular with what places I chose, but I went with Airbnb so I could at least enjoy the road trip a bit more rather than staying in a crowded hotel. My first Airbnb was in Wyoming, and the route through the state doesn't pass through any big cities, really, so it was in a really small town. It was probably no bigger than 2 or 3 miles long. As I passed the border into Wyoming, it started snowing heavily, only dragging on the long day of driving. By the time I got into town, the roads were covered in snow, and the sun had already set. It was pretty dead, though. I mean, I don't know much about small towns, but this seemed exactly how I thought it would be, especially in a low-population state like Wyoming. I was hoping there would be a McDonald's or something that I could get a quick dinner from, but it was very clear that there wasn't going to be. So, I drove through the town and turned down the road to my Airbnb. It was a long driveway leading up to a small home in the middle of a field, with tall snow-covered pine trees lined up in the front yard. I parked on the side, got out with my bag, and then walked around to the front. I put in the code and got inside, closing the door behind me and turning on the lights. It was small, probably 500 square feet, with just a living room and a bedroom. I took my shoes off, dropped my bag next to the bed, and then sat on the couch. When I did, a thump came from the bedroom. I looked back at the doorway I had just come from. It was pretty loud, but I had no idea what it could have been. I got up and walked back, looking into the room and turning on the light. It was all the same. I went and checked the small bathroom that was in there as well, but it all looked good. The only other door in the house was the bedroom closet. I walked over and tugged on the door handle, but it didn't budge. It seemed like it was locked from the other side. At first, I was pretty weirded out that a bedroom closet would be kept shut, but then I thought it could have been a maintenance closet the owner was storing stuff in. There were no other places to put anything, so that was the final conclusion I came to. I went back to the living room and rested my eyes on the couch while thinking through my plan for the next day. After 15 minutes, I got back up and went over to the window, looking out to see if the snow was still coming down and if the roads were even going to be drivable tomorrow. It was eerily dark outside, with no lights from the town showing behind the tall pine trees, and it was still snowing heavily. I shut the blinds and turned back to the couch, but I saw a shadow move in the bedroom. It was slow and smooth, like the shadow of a door opening or closing. I started walking over, listening as I approached the doorway, and looked inside the room. Everything was in place and nothing looked to have caused the shadow I saw, but I knew I saw something moving there. I continued looking around until my eyes fell back on the closet. It was still closed, but something gave me an unsettling feeling about it. I stepped up, grabbed the handle, and it opened with ease. It wasn't locked anymore, but inside there wasn't anything. It was just a small, empty walk-in closet. Before I could fully process everything and try to put the pieces together, I heard someone behind me. When I turned around, a large man was standing in the doorway to the bathroom. He looked beaten and tired, having scratches and cuts all over his face. And as I stared at him, he didn't even seem to care. He stepped into the bedroom, kneeled down, and grabbed a dirty and worn duffel bag from under the bed. The man then stood back up and didn't even look at me as he slowly walked out of the room and out the front door. I ran up and saw him trailing through the snow until he was beyond the lights from the house. I tried to get the police involved, but after giving my description, they really only talked to the Airbnb host. After leaving town, I didn't get any more information. I think it's most likely that he was just using the place to sleep or something, but the way he looked makes me second-guess that. I just can't even think of what could have happened if I'd gone right to bed that night with the man hiding in the closet, just inches away from me.